1. The night she thought she was safe. That night didn't begin with fear. It began with something softer. Emily lay beside him, listening to the quiet rhythm of his breathing. Not rushed, not distant, just there. The room was dim, wrapped in the kind of silence that feels earned at the end of a long day. No arguments, no raised voices. Just two bodies sharing the same space. She told herself this was what safety felt like. Not passion. Not grand promises. Just presence. His arm rested near hers, close enough to feel real. Close enough to convince her that nothing bad could happen in this moment. She stared at the ceiling, letting her thoughts slow down for the first time in weeks. For once, she wasn't waiting for a message. Wasn't bracing for disappointment. Wasn't preparing herself to be left. Because he was here. And in Emily's world, here meant safe. She remembered all the nights before this one. Nights spent alone in her apartment, holding her phone like it was a lifeline. Nights when silence felt like rejection. Nights when she wondered if loving quietly meant loving alone. But tonight was different. Tonight, she believed she had finally crossed some invisible line. From uncertainty to belonging. She didn't need him to say anything. She didn't need reassurance. His physical presence was enough to silence the questions she'd been carrying. Or so she thought. What Emily didn't know yet was that safety can exist in the body, while absence lives in the soul. And sometimes, the most painful losses don't come from being left alone. They come from believing you're finally not. Before we continue this story, if you've ever felt seen in moments like this, if you've ever mistaken presence for connection, please take a moment to subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast. This channel is a quiet space for stories we don't say out loud, stories about grief, love, and the parts of ourselves we try to protect. Because what comes next is where Emily begins to realize that safety was never the same as being held. 2. When silence becomes louder than words. The silence didn't arrive all at once. It crept in, quietly, politely, like it didn't want to be noticed. At first, Emily thought it was just fatigue. Long days, heavy thoughts, the kind of tiredness that doesn't need explaining. But then she started to feel it. The space between breaths. The pauses where responses used to live. The way his body was there, but his attention wasn't. She spoke, and he answered, but only enough to end the sentence. Not enough to continue it. Conversations became shorter, thinner, like they were running out of oxygen. She found herself filling the gaps with nods. With smiles that asked for nothing. The quiet grew heavier. Not the peaceful kind. Not the comforting kind. This was the kind of silence that watches you. That makes you aware of every movement, every thought you didn't say out loud. Emily began to measure herself. Her tone. Her timing. Her words. She wondered which sentence had been the wrong one. Which feeling had been too much. She stopped asking questions, not because she didn't care, but because she was afraid of what the answers wouldn't be. He lay beside her, scrolling on his phone, staring into nothing, breathing steadily, and somehow, she felt more alone than she ever had by herself. There was no argument to point to. No cruel words to replay. Just absence. And absence is difficult to explain to anyone else. It leaves no bruises. No proof. Only the quiet understanding that something essential is missing, and no one is talking about it. Emily realized something terrifying in that silence. You can sit inches away from the person you love, and still be emotionally unreachable. And when no one names it, the silence doesn't just surround you. It settles inside you. 3. Loving someone who is emotionally absent. Loving him was never loud. There were no dramatic exits, no slammed doors. Just a constant feeling of reaching, and never quite touching. Michael wasn't cruel. That was the hardest part. He listened, sometimes. He nodded. He stayed. But he stayed like someone waiting for something else to end. Emily began to understand that his absence wasn't physical. It lived somewhere deeper. In the way his eyes drifted during conversations. In how his answers arrived a second too late. In how he held space, but never stepped into it. She could tell him about her day, her fears, her small hopes, and he would hear the words, but not the weight behind them. It felt like loving someone through glass. Close enough to see every detail. Too far to be felt. She started adjusting herself. Lowering her expectations. Softening her needs. Convincing herself that love didn't have to feel mutual all the time. Maybe this was just how some people loved. Quietly. Carefully. From a distance. She told herself she was strong enough to carry more. But strength has limits. The more present she became, the more invisible she felt. Michael didn't pull away. He simply never arrived. And that kind of absence does something subtle to the heart. It makes you doubt your own emotions. Your right to want more. Your memory of what connection used to feel like. Emily wondered if she was asking for too much. Or if she had simply been asking the wrong person. Because loving someone who is emotionally absent means constantly negotiating with your own loneliness. It means sharing a life while quietly grieving the parts that never show up. And the most painful truth she was beginning to face was this: love doesn't disappear all at once. Sometimes, it fades while both people are still standing in the room. 4. The loneliness that exists inside intimacy. There is a kind of loneliness that doesn't come from being alone. It comes from being close and still unseen. Emily learned this slowly. It showed up in the smallest moments. The way his hand rested on her back, familiar but distant. The way his kiss landed, gentle yet empty, like a habit repeated too many times. They shared a bed. They shared routines. They shared the shape of a life. But intimacy had become mechanical, a sequence of motions without emotional weight. She would lie there afterward, staring into the dark, feeling the space between them widen instead of close. It confused her. Because from the outside, everything looked right. Anyone watching would have thought she was lucky. But loneliness inside intimacy doesn't announce itself loudly. It whispers. It asks quiet questions. Why do I feel invisible when I'm being held? Why does closeness make the emptiness louder? Emily noticed how she began pulling inward, not away from him, but away from herself. She stopped naming what she felt. Stopped reaching for reassurance. Stopped expecting warmth where it no longer lived. There is a particular grief in realizing that intimacy alone cannot save a connection. That bodies can meet while hearts remain untouched. And the loneliest place to be is not an empty room, but a shared space where your emotions have no home. Emily wasn't craving more attention. She was craving recognition. To be felt. To be met. To be emotionally held, not just physically contained. But intimacy without presence becomes a mirror, reflecting back everything you're missing. And in that reflection, Emily began to see herself fading. Not because she was weak, but because she had been loving in a place where her love had nowhere to land. 5. Small moments that slowly break a heart. It wasn't one big moment that broke her. It was the accumulation of small ones. The way he didn't look up when she walked into the room. Not because he was busy, but because he didn't think to. The way her stories began to trail off halfway through, ending in silence instead of response. She noticed how often she said, Never mind. And how easily he let it go. There were texts left unanswered for hours. Not out of anger. Not out of cruelty. Just forgotten. Plans became tentative. Affection became scheduled. Laughter came with an expiration date. Emily began to catalog these moments without meaning to, like her heart was keeping score even when her mind tried not to. She told herself they were small, insignificant, not worth naming. But hearts don't break all at once. They fracture quietly, under the weight of what's missing. She stopped reaching for his hand first. Stopped sending the message that might interrupt his day. Stopped sharing the thoughts that arrived late at night. Not as punishment. As protection. Because every unanswered reach left a mark. And every time she lowered her needs, something in her went quiet. There was no argument she could point to. No betrayal to explain her sadness. Just the slow erosion of feeling chosen. She wondered how something so gentle could hurt this deeply. How love could end not with a goodbye, but with 1,000 tiny dismissals. And in those small moments, Emily realized something she had been avoiding. A heart can only bend so many times before it learns to stop hoping. 6. The night she finally stops asking. That night, nothing dramatic happened. No raised voices. No slammed doors. No final argument to mark the moment. Emily realized it quietly. In the middle of a thought she chose not to finish. She had been about to ask something small. Something harmless. Did you hear what I said? Do you still want this? Are we okay? But the question stayed inside her. Not because she didn't care, but because she already knew how they would land. She watched him move through the room, familiar and distant. The way he answered without turning around. The way his attention belonged somewhere else. And for the first time, Emily didn't reach for him. She didn't soften her voice. Didn't rephrase her feelings to make them easier to accept. Didn't turn her needs into jokes. She simply stopped. There was a strange calm in that decision. Not relief. Not anger. Just clarity. She understood something that night. Asking repeatedly for presence doesn't create it. Explaining your pain over and over doesn't make someone feel it. And begging for emotional connection only teaches your heart that it must shrink to survive. Emily sat with the quiet, not the heavy kind, but the kind that arrives after exhaustion. She felt the weight lift, even as the loss settled in. Because when you stop asking, you stop hoping for a version of someone they have never shown you. That night, she mourned something silently. Not the relationship. Not him. But the version of herself. Who believed love would eventually meet her halfway. She lay in bed beside him, closer than ever, and understood that this was the turning point. Not the end, but the moment she chose herself enough to stop asking for what should have been freely given. 7. Why some people can't stay emotionally present. It's easy to label people like Michael as cold, detached, unwilling. But the truth is more complicated than that. Some people don't stay emotionally present. Not because they don't care, but because presence once cost them too much. Michael had learned, long before Emily, that closeness can disappear without warning. That opening yourself fully doesn't guarantee you'll be met. So he adapted. He learned how to stay functional instead of vulnerable. How to show up physically while keeping the deeper parts of himself protected. He wasn't avoiding her. He was avoiding what intimacy demanded. Because emotional presence asks for risk. It asks you to feel uncertainty. To sit with discomfort. To face the possibility of loss. And for some people, that feels unbearable. Michael didn't know how to stay. When emotions became heavy, he didn't know how to hold space. without feeling like he was losing control. So he withdrew, not dramatically, but subtly, through distraction, through silence, through half-answers that kept him safe. To him, this wasn't absence. It was survival. But survival can look like abandonment to the person standing across from you. Emily wasn't asking for perfection. She wasn't asking him to heal his past. She was asking for presence. And the tragedy of loving someone like Michael is that they often want to give more, they just don't know how. Because staying emotionally present requires skills no one ever taught them. It requires language for feelings they were told to ignore. It requires courage to stay when leaving feels easier. And until someone learns that, their distance isn't a choice. It's a pattern. One that repeats quietly until someone finally stops waiting. 8. Grief without a funeral. Grief usually comes with rituals. Flowers. Condolences. A moment where the world agrees that something has been lost. But this kind of grief had none of that. There was no ending to point to. No final conversation. No goodbye. Emily was still in the relationship. But she was already grieving it. She woke up each morning beside the same person, yet carried a quiet ache that no one else could see. How do you mourn something that technically still exists? There was no permission to be sad. No language for this loss. Friends would ask how things were going, and she would smile and say, "Fine." Because explaining emotional absence sounds like complaining. Because grieving someone who hasn't left feels illegitimate. So she carried it alone. She mourned the version of the relationship she had believed in. The future she had imagined without realizing she was imagining it alone. This grief didn't arrive in waves. It settled. In her chest. In her voice. In the way joy began to feel distant and fragile. She noticed herself pulling back from things she loved. Laughing less freely. Moving more carefully. Not because she was broken, but because she was quietly saying goodbye to something that never announced its ending. There was no ceremony for this loss. No one brought food. No one checked in. Yet the grief was real. And heavier, somehow, because she had to carry it. Without acknowledgement. This is what grief looks like when there is no funeral. When the person is still alive. Still present. Still sleeping beside you. But the connection you needed has already disappeared. 9. Being not alone can still destroy you. People often say that loneliness comes from being alone. Emily learned how wrong that was. Because she wasn't alone. Not technically. There was someone beside her. Someone to share meals with. Someone whose name she could say out loud when asked. And yet, something inside her was quietly unraveling. Being not alone gave the pain a strange shape. One that was harder to explain, harder to justify. How do you tell someone you feel abandoned when there is clearly someone still there? So Emily stayed quiet. She watched herself grow smaller in a relationship that looked full from the outside. She stopped trusting her instincts. Stopped naming her emptiness. Stopped believing she had the right to feel this way. Because being not alone made her question herself. Maybe she was too sensitive. Too needy. Too much. But the truth was simpler and heavier. Loneliness doesn't come from the absence of people. It comes from the absence of being understood. Emily could reach out and touch him, but there was nowhere to land emotionally. And that kind of loneliness is corrosive. It eats away slowly. It convinces you that your needs are unreasonable. That wanting connection is a flaw. Being not alone trapped her between guilt and grief. Guilt for wanting more. Grief for realizing she might never get it here. And the longer she stayed, the more she disappeared from herself. Not in dramatic ways, but in quiet ones. She laughed less freely, spoke less honestly, dreamed less vividly. Because surviving in emotional isolation requires a kind of numbness. And numbness, over time, can destroy you just as surely as loss. Emily began to see the truth she had been avoiding. Being alone can hurt, but being unseen while together can hollow you out completely. 10. The quiet goodbye no one notices. The goodbye didn't happen all at once. There was no announcement. No decision spoken out loud. It unfolded quietly, in moments so small they looked like nothing at all. Emily didn't leave the room. She didn't pack a bag. She didn't stop showing up. She just stopped arriving. She noticed it in the way she no longer waited for him to finish a sentence. In how she stopped saving stories for later. In how her heart learned to brace itself without asking permission. The goodbye lived in the pauses. In the space between a question and the answer she no longer needed. In the sigh she didn't explain. In the tears she didn't wipe away because she didn't cry anymore. She still said good morning. Still asked if he was hungry. Still shared the rituals that made everything look intact. But inside, she had already begun to detach. Not out of anger. Not out of spite. Out of self-preservation. Emily understood that leaving loudly would have required confrontation, and confrontation would have required hope. And hope was the one thing she could no longer afford. So she left quietly. She withdrew her expectations first. Then her vulnerability. Then the parts of herself that once reached for him without fear. This is how some goodbyes happen. Not with doors closing, but with hearts folding inward. Michael didn't notice. Why would he? Nothing had changed on the surface. But something essential had shifted. Emily was no longer waiting to be chosen. She was choosing herself in silence. And the quiet goodbye, the one no one notices, is often the most final of all. 11. Learning to leave without being hated. Emily didn't want to leave as the villain. She didn't want anger to be the loudest thing remembered. She understood something many people don't. Leaving doesn't always mean blaming. So she learned how to go quietly, with clarity instead of accusation. She stopped collecting evidence. Stopped rehearsing speeches she would never give. Stopped hoping he would finally understand. Because understanding wasn't required for her to move on. She didn't need him to admit fault. Didn't need apologies that arrived too late. Didn't need closure shaped like agreement. What she needed was permission. From herself. Emily realized that staying gentle didn't mean staying small. It meant choosing integrity over retaliation. She let go of the urge to explain herself perfectly. Let go of the fantasy that if she found the right words, he would suddenly become present. She accepted that sometimes, people don't hate you, they just don't meet you. And leaving without being hated means leaving without demanding to be understood. It means trusting your own experience even when it's invisible to others. Emily practiced boundaries that didn't shout. Distance that didn't punish. Silence that wasn't cold, but complete. She allowed him to keep his version of the story. She kept hers. Because peace didn't require agreement. It required alignment. And alignment meant walking away with her dignity intact. She didn't need to be remembered as right. She needed to be free. 12. Healing begins when you stop waiting to be seen. Healing didn't begin the day Emily left. It began the day she stopped asking permission to exist. At first, the quiet felt unfamiliar. Not the painful silence she had carried for months. But a new kind of stillness. Almost awkward, like a room after guests have gone. She expected to feel empty. Instead, she felt honest. Honest about what it cost to stay. Honest about how long she had been translating her needs into something smaller, safer, easier to ignore. For a while, her body kept the old habits. She reached for her phone, waited for a name that wouldn't appear, braced for the same disappointment, even though there was no one left to disappoint her. That's the strange thing about emotional abandonment. It teaches you to abandon yourself first. So healing, for Emily, wasn't about finding someone new. It was about returning to the person she had been fading away from. She started with simple things. Eating without rushing. Sleeping without waiting for a text. Walking outside and letting sunlight touch her face without guilt. She began to notice her own thoughts again, not as problems to solve, but as signals to respect. Some days, grief still visited, not as a storm, but as a soft ache in the ribs. And on those days, she did something she had never done before. She stayed with herself. No negotiating, no begging, no rewriting her feelings to make them acceptable. She learned that being seen begins with seeing yourself clearly, and refusing to disappear just because someone else won't look. Emily didn't leave with hatred. She left with a truth. Love isn't proven by proximity. It's proven by presence. And if you have to shrink to keep someone, you're not being loved, you're being endured. Healing begins the moment you stop waiting to be noticed, and start choosing your own life with your full voice. If this story touched something in you, if you've ever felt alone while someone was right there, you're not weak. You're not too much. You're human. And you deserve a love that stays. Before you go, please like this video, share it with someone who might need it, and leave a comment, even just one sentence, about what part hit you the hardest. And if you want more stories like this, quiet, honest, and healing, subscribe to Hidden Angle Podcast. Your support helps these stories reach the people who feel them in silence.